My name is Dominic Watson, and this is my installation for Art Catlin, which is called Lowbrow Ecstasy. The idea for the work actually came from seeing the space when Justin, the curator, kind of showed me around. We're walking through, and obviously you see all these massive, vast rooms, and then we kind of, he was telling me about the show and the idea, and he kind of walked through the space, and then we kind of turned this corner, and he's like, yeah, and this is going to be your space. So it was kind of like the cubby hole of the whole place. And I'd done some leather jacket works prior to being in the show, and I think originally I wanted to do like a video piece, because that's what I normally do. I normally make videos, but I kind of got keen on the idea of doing a cloakroom or like a wardrobe. So it definitely felt site specific. The scale was really important, I think. So I started thinking about what I could do, how I could. I'd done text pieces on leather jackets before, but I wanted to kind of move on from that a bit. And so I decided to incorporate Mills and Boon imagery which is like Mills and Boon, like a lowbrow publishing company who do kind of trashy women's erotic fiction. And so I was really interested in like subverting the role of like the leather jacket, what that meant. That's quite like a heavy masculine object, and the Mills and Boon imagery is kind of, or what we associate with Mills and Boon is like kind of complete opposite. So I had this image of like a lot of bikers kind of riding down the road with these kind of quite feminine leather jackets on. So that was kind of the original starting point. Like for this, I mean, they look like they've kind of come on holiday by mistake. They're wearing like slacks and chinos on a beach. And almost a stranger. It's like the imagery is almost like not romantic. But if you read into it and like go behind it, then beneath it there is this kind of darker desire and darker fantasy. So there's something kind of weirdly subtle about the specific imagery I chose, I think. I mean, this one, for instance, is like pagan surrender, yet the imagery looks like it could be like just a young couple on holiday. It's like really innocent, but there's something like, I think there's something like deeper behind like the surface of it. And I've always kind of been interested in sort of, I guess, cliches and stereotypes, which I think the leather jacket serves that purpose in relation to kind of masculinity. And especially in terms of identity, I've always been interested in this idea of identity and how we produce it. And I think I often think of it as a form of consumption, like we consume certain things, whether it's like clothes, style, music, or even like food. What you consume is a form of like self-creation. That's how we define ourselves now. The painting on leather jackets, what that originally kind of stemmed from, this idea of maybe like counterculture movements, punk, rock, metal, and the action of painting on the jacket originally was sort of a political gesture. It was like a fuck you to the status quo. It was like, I'm choosing to exist outside of a particular way of life or a particular mode of existence, and that was like a really political gesture. And somehow that type of visual communication seems to be, I don't know, like empty now. It's like it's just reduced to artifice. And like, especially as a kid growing up, there was never I was never part of a subculture. I think the last kind of real counterculture movement I can think of was like grunge, which was like at the early 90s. So I was like, all we had was modes of reinterpreting different pre-existing forms. So I think that's like the way the interest in stereotype comes from, and cliches. I think there is kind of like there is something in the arbitrary and the default that is worth investigating. And I think in relation to making art objects as well, it's really interesting because, like I said previously, I normally make videos. So the idea of like producing an object which inherently has its supposed determined value, whether it's by culture or society, it has an inherent value, which is kind of, I guess, a slightly intimidating process. But when it enters into like a strange like desire economy, it's just like I see it as this reduced form of like sexual exchange, which is what I think the type of imagery that Mills and Boon offers. It's a really nice, simple metaphor, but there's something kind of complicated about my relationship with that, being kind of like coming from like a liberal arts background. You have like you develop like a pseudo moral high ground which you try to always maintain, but there's something kind of, you're inevitably implicit in whatever socio political economic structure. And you're always like, you can't escape capital. You can't escape capital. So there was something about the kind of darker, seedy side of like making objects and engaging in this kind of engaging in making consumer products and what that means. And part of you is like you don't want to engage in it, but secretly you're seduced by it, and like you come in. And that was you mentioned the carpet earlier. That was kind of the feeling I wanted to have when the viewer walked into the space. There's certain like sensation on their feet where you're being seduced into it. You're like, it's an effect. And so I guess thinking about the work as a whole, it's somehow like a self-reflexive of the process of producing art objects, I think, for me. I was interested in like setting it up almost like a bit like a shop, and equally a bit like a front room, hence the shag. I wanted to be sort of like a middle class, kind of gross living room you'd find in like, I don't know, up in Crouch End or something.